We're going to open our Bibles to Matthew chapter 5. We're looking at the Sermon on the Mount. And we're picking up today in verse 21. So one of the things we do in Sunday school, when we schedule these 6-week segments, we leave ourselves a room. We have those single shot days, and just in case weather comes, we're okay. So we're not missing anything. We'll skip our single shot, and we're just going to pick up right where we left off last time, and so we don't miss a week in the Sermon on the Mount, provided there's not another bad weather Sunday. So, one of the great things about the live stream, though, is even if we cancel services, one of us can get here and preach. So I anticipate that if ever we cancel services again, I will still preach. I was out of town last Sunday, but Zach was here. How many of you watched it live last week? Well, I did. Tanya and I watched it, and it was a joy to see Zach bringing the word. And so in the future, if we have to cancel, we'll do that. By the way, our online offering last week, people gave online. It was like $16,000. Now, that's not our normal offering, but hey, it's in the past on a Sunday like that, nothing would have been given. So we can, it's not as good as being together, is it? I like being together with brothers and sisters and getting to say hello and give somebody a hug or pat each other on the back or cry together or whatever. But when we can't assemble, it's great to have that option. So the live stream and you can even give online. So remember that if we have to call church for weather, which I'm hoping we don't. So let's pick up where we left off in Matthew 5:21. Remember, I've told you that what we're looking for here is, well, the overall theme of the Sermon on the Mount is about righteousness. And the point that Jesus is making over and over and over is you don't have any. You don't have righteousness. You think that you have righteousness because of what you do, but Jesus is making the point that it goes beyond what you do to who you are. And who you are is a problem. So he's showing us that we don't have righteousness. Now, he does this in a series of really, he's talking about different topics that have to do with righteousness. And in each one, he's sort of building up to a peak. He sort of makes an ethical point about righteousness, and then he'll back down and he starts another subject and he builds to a peak. The whole Sermon on the Mount is directed toward the big peak of the whole thing is that ask, seek, knock passage that's coming on over in there. But so we're still in the early part of the Sermon on the Mount. So Jesus is now launching from salt and light to, in verse 20, he says to the farmers and fishermen and housewives that are gathered there in Galilee to hear him what must have been terribly depressing. He says, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, if you're a typical Jew growing up in Israel, you look at the scribes and the Pharisees as the guys that are really serious about honoring God. And you think of them as the most righteous. In fact, that's the word that was used of them. They were the Sadiq. And you've probably heard of Hasidic Jews, and that comes from that Hebrew word, the Sadiq, the Sadiqah, the righteous Jews. And that's what the Orthodox are, the Hasidic, the righteous Jews. And so the scribes and the Pharisees in their day were the righteous Jews. And Jesus says to these people, well, unless you're more righteous than they are, you can't go to heaven. Well, that must have really hit them full force. What do you mean? Man, my righteousness isn't anything like theirs. Well, Jesus is going to go ahead and he's going to start making a case of how you are not righteous. Now, he's He's driving us to despair for a reason. Remember, this is what the gospel does. The gospel always drives us to despair so that it might then give us gospel relief. There is no need for the gospel if you don't understand God's justice and judgment. If you don't understand your own lack of righteousness, there's no need for the gospel. So the gospel always causes distress. It always causes terror and fear. This is what the law does. The law brings death. And as we face the truth of the law, then this makes our hearts cry out for relief. Is there any hope? Is there any answer to this incredible problem? And of course, God answers that cry with the gospel of Jesus Christ, that we can have his righteousness. So that's really what Jesus is doing with the Sermon on the Mount. So he's telling you, you don't have any righteousness. Now, he said that if your righteousness doesn't exceed that of the Pharisees, you can't go to heaven. Now he's going to flesh it out. No pun intended, but he's going to show us that our flesh has no righteousness. Verse 21, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council. And whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. So if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First, be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you're going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out until you've paid the last penny. Well, this is interesting ethical teaching Jesus gives us here. Now, this is the first time he uses this formula, and you're going to see it several times in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus said, now, you've heard it said, but I say. And in doing this, Jesus is accomplishing several things. The first one is doing something in us. We have constructed our own sense of self-righteousness. We've kidded ourselves into thinking we're okay. And we think we're okay because we'll say, well, I never killed anybody. And what we'll say is something that we think we've never done. And I've been involved in prison ministry a lot in my life, and it always strikes me. I've talked to murderers who said, well, at least I never raped anybody, or at least I'm not a pedophile. I've talked to rapists who said, well, I didn't do anything with children. And I've talked to rapists who said, well, I never killed anybody. They're always looking at what they haven't done. And what is that? It's just that tendency in us to construct our own self-righteousness. Well, I haven't done that. Man, I know I've done some things, but I do have standards, and that's the way we kid ourselves into thinking that we're okay. Well, Jesus here says, oh, okay, now you've heard it said, you shall not kill. And you think you're okay because you've not killed anybody. But I'm telling you, it goes beyond what you do all the way to what you are. Because he says, I say, if you're angry with your brother, you're liable to judgment. Okay, now this just upped the ante, because I can say I've never killed anybody, but I can't say I've never wanted to. You know, there have been people that I have just thought were so wicked and so harmful to other people that I've just said, Lord, would you just kill that person? And I have felt such anger. Sometimes it's because of what they've done to other people. Sometimes it's because of what they've done to me. But in my heart, I wanted them dead. If they dropped dead on the spot, man, I would have said, see there? That proves I'm right. That's just who we are. One of my favorite old movies, this is a really old movie, a W.C. Fields movie, is called If I Had a Million. And in it, there's this millionaire who's dying, and his family is gathered outside his room, and they just can't wait for him to die because they think they're going to inherit the money. So they're playing a song on the Victrola called "I'll Be Glad When You're Dead, You Rascal You," and he determines he's not going to leave them anything. So he has his lawyer come, and they just go through the phone book, and he picks out a name, a random name out of the phone book, and gives them $1 million. And W.C. Fields is one of the people who gets this $1 million from this dying millionaire. And when he's introduced in the movie, he's driving a car and people keep cutting him off. And, you know, in his very imitable way, W.C. Fields, you know, acts like road hog. And, you know, he sort of shakes his fist at him. So when he gets $1 million, he discovers that he's inherited this $1 million. He goes to the car dealership and he buys every car on the lot. And he gets in the lead car and he has drivers in each car, and they just go with this caravan down the road. And somebody cuts him off. W.C. Fields takes his car and he just rams into the guy. He gets out, he gets in the next car, and away they go. And this is what he does with his $1 million. He just goes around ramming people that cut him off because that it just is so satisfying to him to get even. And he drives like a tank. When I watched that movie as a kid, I remember there was something satisfying about that. I saw that before I could even drive. There have been so many times I've been driving on the Gene Snyder in Louisville, and I've thought about that movie. You know, I thought, man, if I had $1 million, of course I could buy fewer cars than W.C. Fields in that day, but you know, there's just something in us that wants revenge. We can say we've never killed anybody, but man, there have been times that we've wished in our heart that something bad would happen to somebody. We don't see them as bearers of the image of God. We don't treasure them the way God does. And you know what Jesus is really saying here is that murder doesn't always leave a corpse behind. We can be guilty of murder without actually killing somebody. Murder doesn't always leave a corpse, but it always leaves conviction. We're convicted by the law. Even if Jesus says, even though we've not done it, the law goes beyond what we do. It goes to who we are. Everyone is bound by the law. Murderers are bound by liability, but you know, when it comes to taking life, restitution is impossible. If I steal $100 from you, and I'm convicted of that, I can restore that. I can give you $100 back. But if I take someone's life, there's no giving that back. And Jesus here, when he's talking about our anger, what he's reminding us is that when we hate somebody, when we call somebody a fool, when we insult our brother, your words are like a murderous weapon. They kill relationships. They destroy reputations. They eradicate restitution. When you're angry with your brother, when you insult your brother, when you demean and diminish your brother, Jesus says, look at the response to each of these things. Jesus said, everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. So Jesus is telling us there's a judge you stand before that's not the judge of the law. Not like if you kill somebody, you go stand before an earthly judge. Jesus is telling us that even when we're guilty of these things in our heart, there is a judge that we will stand before and answer to for even the thoughts of and intentions of our heart. You'll be liable to judgment. You'll be liable to the council. Of course, I think this is the counsel of the eternal will of God. Whoever says you fool will be liable to the hell of fire. Jesus talks about hell more than anyone else. This is why it always amuses me when people say, well, Jesus never talked about such and such. Jesus never talked about that. Why should we emphasize that? Jesus never talked about that. But the same people who say we shouldn't talk about the things Jesus didn't talk about are not talking about the things Jesus did talk about. Because Jesus talked a lot about hell. And you just don't hear much talk about hell at all. But Jesus says, even if you just call somebody a fool, you're in danger. You're liable to the hell of fire. So if you're offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First, be reconciled to your brother. Now, I have a sermon that I have preached on this word first in the Gospel of Matthew. This is the third time Jesus uses this. Actually, I take that back. This is the first time. He uses it here, uses it in 6:33. He uses it in 7:5. So he uses it 3 times in the Sermon on the Mount. And there's a specific order to it. So you ask yourself, what are the priorities of Jesus? What are the priorities of Jesus? And in the Sermon on the Mount, 3 times he uses this word. The first one is the priority of being right with your brother. He says, so it's the priority of fellowship. If you're about to give your offering and you remember that there's something between you and your brother, don't give your offering yet. Leave your offering and go first be reconciled to your brother. Look at this priority. Jesus wants you to put fellowship even before worship. Now, we think worship is God's highest priority. And in a sense, you can argue that. But what Jesus is saying is, if you've got something between you and a brother or sister, you are not prepared to worship. God wants you to deal with issues of fellowship before worship. Leave your offering. Go first be reconciled to your brother. Then come and give your offering. You know, sometimes when I preach that, I've had people push back and say, well, if God didn't want my offering, I won't give it then. Well, now look, read what it says. God doesn't say, don't give your offering. He says, leave your offering. First, go be reconciled. So I call that tainted money. It taint yours, right? That's the Lord's money. Yeah? He's not saying keep your old offering. He's saying it's not your offering. You know, that's his. But you need to go first, be reconciled to your brother, and then come, you're ready to give your offering. God doesn't want your money. He wants your relationship. He wants you to be in fellowship with brothers and sisters. He wants you to be in fellowship with him. And then you're ready to give your offering. First, be reconciled to your brother. Your anger can nullify and invalidate your worship and service. Is it not true that you'll have more arguments on Sunday morning than about any other time during the week? Trying to get kids ready to come to church, and you know, you get exasperated, and husbands and wives tend to sometimes be at each other's throats on Sunday morning, and sometimes by the time you get the kids ready and in the car and on the way, they get in a fuss or whatever. By the time you get to church, you feel like you've lost your religion. You come in just all exasperated and angry with each other and trying to get the kids in their class and being late. And then, okay, now let's sing hymns. Let's worship the Lord. Let's listen to a sermon. Let's give our offering. When the whole time you're seething in anger. Satan just has a way of showing up at our houses on Sunday morning. He tries to disrupt. He wants to take us out of a spirit of worship. Jesus said that our fellowship affects our worship. Anger can nullify and invalidate your worship and service. And a right relationship with your brother is a greater offering than your money. And conscious bitterness can be a spiritual barrier. Now, the Bible has a lot to say about that. Bitterness causes a lot of things in our lives. Hebrews tells us that a root of bitterness springing up can defile our flesh like Esau. It causes sexual immorality. You would not believe how many times when I counsel people who are in some kind of sin of promiscuity, as I begin to talk to them about their past, that there's an incredible bitterness there. Might be a bitterness against a spouse, bitterness against a parent. But a lot of times, their response to this root of bitterness in their lives is to seek to fulfill the lust of the flesh. That's a pattern. And another way we do it is just through trying to hurt people and accumulate power. Jesus here warns us against this, that a conscious bitterness is a spiritual barrier. And reconciliation is at the heart of redemption. Over and over in his ministry, Jesus tells us you can't be reconciled to God and be wrong with your brother. You can't be forgiven and withhold forgiveness. These are incompatible. You can't be wrongly related to your brother and rightly related to God. Now, this is a terrifying prospect. This should cause us to examine ourselves, because we justify our anger at brothers. We feel sometimes correctly wronged, and so we think that somehow gives us permission. Because we are legitimately wronged, it gives us permission to have bitterness or hostility. But it doesn't. We're to forgive. Even Jesus, who preaches this Sermon on the Mount, will one day hang on a cross and say, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. Jesus forgives those who crucified him. How much more should we be able to forgive those who wound and hurt us? Your anger can cost you years of emotional captivity. Look what he says in verse 25. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you're going with him to court, lest your accuser hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Now, there have been many, many times that I have seen married couples. You know, they've got all kinds of problems, and been several times I've been working with married couples, and finally one of them will get mad at the other, and then they go file papers or a restraining order or something. Okay, now they've put it in the legal system, and it's totally out of their hands. I know one person who tried to, as they were getting a divorce, tried to make a move so that it was a power play, so that her husband could not have access to their children. There was no allegation of abuse or anything like that. They were just angry. They were just mad. And the judge was, of course, seen a lot of this before, and he saw what she was doing, and man, she ended up, it cost her so much. The judge found pretty much completely in her husband's favor, and they were then living in different states, and the judge required her to drive their children to him on the weekends that he had them, and then she had to pick them up and take them back. And man, it backfired in a big way. Jesus warns us here. Okay, you better find a way to settle things amicably when you have an adversary. He said, settle with them quickly before you get before the judge, because once you're before the judge, you have no control over what happens. Now, Jesus here is using an earthly scenario, but it has a heavenly importance. What he's saying is that your anger can lead you into years of emotional captivity. If you don't deal with it quickly, it gets worse. And it snowballs. It gets out of your control. Anger can delude you into self-righteousness. Isn't it true that when someone has hurt and wounded us, we feel, what's the word? Justified. We feel justified in our anger. Well, that person left me out of something. He did something for somebody else he didn't do for me. Well, I deserve that more than they do. And we start talking like that to ourselves. We feel entitled. We feel self-righteous. And here's the problem. We're not righteous. It's a false feeling. It's a lie that we tell ourselves. And the process of anger then leads to, Jesus says, imprisonment. Hey, he said, you get before the judge, you don't know where that's going. The judge turn you over to the guard throw you into prison. Now, Jesus elsewhere uses this metaphor of prison for bitterness. Remember the unforgiving servant that the king says, hey, I forgave you all your debt. You can't forgive this guy this little debt. Turn that guy over to the tormentors. Throw him into prison until he can pay what he owes. And, of course, again, there's an earthly story, but it has an eternal significance. Jesus is warning us. The longer that anger lasts, the less likely is its resolution. We hang on to it. We feel justified. And the greater your anger, the greater your debt. You can't pay what you owe. You're thrown into prison. So you can't deal with what you need to deal with. So Jesus says, I say to you, you will never get out until you've paid the last penny. Man, you've got a debt you can't pay, and you can't get out until it's paid, you're trapped. And that's what your own self-righteousness will do for you. Your feeling of justified anger, your feeling of hurt and woundedness, it's going to make you be imprisoned. Now that's true in this life. How much more is it true for eternity? And this is what Jesus is warning us about. So notice that Jesus is talking on several levels here. He is talking on the ethical level of your human existence. You have an adversary, you better try and settle with them soon. You don't put yourself in a situation you cannot control. He said, do your best to settle with them. Get rid of your self-righteousness. But this is also true on the spiritual level. That sometimes we sit in judgment on God. Sometimes we're angry at God. We're angry at God for how he made somebody or what he let happen or what he didn't do. And we feel justified in our anger. I've actually had people say to me, when I stand before God, he's going to have a lot to answer to me for. I would be terrified to say such a thing, lest I find myself instantaneously standing before God and realizing he's not going to answer to me for anything. He does not answer to me. I answer to him. And Jesus wants us to see that. So anger comes with a great cost. You think it's great you haven't killed anybody? Well, pat yourself on the back. The problem is not what you do or don't do, it's who you are. The heart of the problem is the problem of your heart. And this is what Jesus is saying. Now he turns to lust. All right, so anger, totally, we can keep our cool, we can control our actions, and yet still be consumed with anger, can we not? The same thing is true with lust. Look at verse 27. You've heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Jesus is talking to us about very practical matters, but the other thing I want you to see, he's also showing us that he's the new Moses, right? When he says, you've heard it said, he's quoting something from the law. But I say to you, he says, I'm going beyond Moses. Now, this is an audacious thing Jesus is saying, right? If I stood up here and I preached and I said, now you've read in the Bible that it says, but now I'm saying to you, you would go, wait just a minute, preacher, you have overstepped your bounds. The only authority you have is to tell us what the Bible says. Your authority begins and ends with the Scripture. And you would be correct. If I were saying, now the Bible says, but I'm saying, the truth is you can just disregard that part, right? I'm just giving you an opinion at that point. And yours is as valid as mine. Opinions are like elbows. Everybody's got a couple of them. And, that's nothing significant. But Jesus, when he says, you've heard it said, but I say to you, he's making an audacious claim. And that claim is that he is the giver of the law. that he is the prophet like unto Moses that God promised. That the law he gives is a law about the heart. It's not merely about what we do. So, you've heard it that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Jesus said, okay, it's not just about what you do. Whether or not you have had sex with another woman, it's about what you think. It's about what you are. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away, for it's better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away, for it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go to hell. All right, let's unpack this a little bit. Think about what Jesus is saying. First of all, Jesus is clearly calling his disciples to an ethic that is higher than the law, because the law addresses what we do. I mean, the General Assembly could not pass a law that says no citizen of the Commonwealth of Kentucky may think such and such. I mean, they can't do that. There's no way you can police the thinking of people. But God does. God has such a law. God says, what you think violates my law. So the law addresses what we do, but Christ addresses what we are. The law forbids adultery, but let's just ask, where are the boundaries? Where are the boundaries? Is flirting wrong? Is having an innocent lunch together with a person of the opposite sex other than your spouse, is that wrong? Okay, where's the line? How about sending salacious text messages? Okay, if a guy's sending sexually oriented text messages to a woman, not his wife, and she's sending some like that back, have they committed adultery? Where's the line? How about exchanging pictures, nude pictures, explicit pictures? So is that adultery? How about kissing? How about touching? How about pornography? So where's the line? Now, as I start throwing these things out, we all could cite very public events where we've heard people justify what they did and say, well, I didn't really commit adultery because I didn't do X. Oh, it was just this. Oh, it's not really adultery. But here's the reality. Jesus said all of that is adultery. Every bit of it. The minute you thought it, you crossed the line. It's not just what you do, it's what you think. Jesus goes straight to the heart to expose our sin. Now, this sin has two elements. One is looking. Now, Jesus here is talking to us about a physical stimulus. A man looks at a woman with lust in his heart. So he looks. There's a physical stimulus, but then what's the response? Think of it like this. David, remember in 1 Samuel 11 or 2 Samuel 11, David, it was the time of year when kings go forth to wage war, but David remained in Jerusalem, and he's up on the roof of his palace there, and he steps out and he sees a beautiful woman taking a bath. Now, has he sinned? Well, the act of seeing her was not a sin. But then he looked. Now see, if he'd seen it and he's, that's not proper, I must leave. He wouldn't have sinned. But what does he do? He looks and he lusts and he acts. He sins for her. And what began as he wasn't looking for her, but he saw her, but then he began to look at her. So he allows the lust to grow from the physical stimulus, and then he acts on that lust, and he sins for her, and the rest is literally history. So what Jesus is saying here, he said, you know, if you look at her, there's the physical stimulus with lust in your heart. That's a mental indulgence and imagination. Then that sin has two consequences. One is guilt. Jesus said he has already committed adultery in his heart. He's already committed. So the first consequence is guilt. Even if you've never acted outwardly on it, but you've regarded it in your heart, you've enabled your heart to have these feelings, then you're guilty. You have guilt. But then the second consequence is behavior, because the body will follow the heart. And Jesus says here, that as he goes on to talk about it, he talks about then the members of the body that offend, that cause us to sin. So Jesus proposes a solution. And Jesus' solution is a radical commitment to holiness. Jesus says you need to eliminate anything that leads you to sin. Because, you know, sin can never have a cost-benefit analysis. Sin will give you a small amount of pleasure. The Bible is very honest about that. There is pleasure in sin for a short time. Sin is fun. If it weren't fun, people wouldn't do it. So there is fun. There is pleasure in sin. But does that temporary pleasure compare with eternity in hell? It does not. And this is what Jesus is saying. So, well, it'd be better to go through life blind than to go to hell for eternity. It'd be better to go through life with one arm than to go to hell completely whole. Jesus says sin never survives a cost-benefit analysis. It's not going to give you any benefit. But I've got to ask you something here. When Jesus proposes this solution, do you think he really thinks that blind men don't lust or one-handed men don't steal? I will never forget Tanya and I did a Mediterranean cruise back in 2001. And we were on this ship, and we were sailing there near Thessalonica, and there's this big mountain, 6,000 feet, rises right out of the Mediterranean there, called Mount Athos. And it's considered by the Greek Orthodox a holy mountain. And there are all kinds of monasteries all over the mountain. And no females are allowed on Mount Athos. And when I say no females, I don't mean only humans. I mean there are no female sheep. There are no female goats. There are no female donkeys. Because why? Well, they want the monks to be holy. Now, I'm just going to say something rather crude and blunt here. But how holy are these guys if they can't have female donkeys on that mountain? Do you see, this is the human effort at holiness. That's what it looks like. Well, let's just eliminate. Let's just, let's become monks, and let's live in a monastery on a holy mountain, and let's get rid of all temptation, and then we'll be holy. But here's the problem. Your heart's still sinful. You can't get rid of your heart. Jesus is intentionally giving us a solution that he well knows doesn't make you holy. And this is intentional, because blind men can still burn with lust, and armless men can still covet and figure out some way to steal. But by giving us this law, Jesus is clearly saying we need a radical commitment to holiness. And he's saying that holiness is greater than any temporary sinful pleasure. He's clearly saying that. But he's also saying, if the law drives you to the gospel, if the law drives you to Christ, then the Sermon on the Mount turbocharges that drive, because it amps it up. Because in this statement, Christ has exposed my sin, and he has heightened my guilt, and he has given me an inadequate solution. I could chop off both hands and pluck out both eyes and still find that I am trapped in my sin. So Jesus has made me feel really very hopeless here. And there's a reason, because I am in myself hopeless. He's told me to pluck out my eye if I need to be holy. He's told me to chop off my hand if I need to be holy. But the reality is, that won't make me holy. But Jesus has given his eye for me. He's given his hand for me. Jesus has saved me from my sin, and he strengthened me with his own righteousness. Now see, this is where he's going with the Sermon on the Mount. You are not righteous. And this solution is an inadequate solution, because it ultimately is driving me to the only solution that is adequate, and that's Jesus himself. But he's got to make us feel the hopelessness of our own efforts first. And that's why how he's using this. He's finally going to give me hope. The most radical move you will ever make is not to cut off your hand or to pluck out your eye, but to cut off your own sense of self-righteousness and to cast yourself completely on Christ. That's what he's saying. And it's true. There's no question. He's saying we need a radical commitment to holiness. It's better to go through life without anything and to have heaven than to go through life with everything and to go to hell. And now he goes on in verse 31. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, in Jesus' day, divorce had gotten quite commonplace. Now, by the way, the system was rigged completely in favor of men. Woman, it was virtually impossible. There were a few cases, but it was virtually impossible for a woman to divorce her husband for anything. She was usually considered chattel. He could dominate her, he could abuse her, he could beat her. He wasn't supposed to, but the law was not going to let a woman have her own rights. But a man, all he had to do was signify his intention to divorce her. And a woman who had been divorced was used goods. And she had no way of supporting herself. She had no way and she really couldn't remarry. She wasn't considered proper for someone to remarry. And so divorce had become quite rife, and they had all these complex laws, and you had to go through this process of taking off your shoe and all this, but it was easy for a man to obtain a divorce. And Jesus comes along, and man, he totally does away with that. I mean, Jesus talks about divorce quite a bit, and here as he goes to this, he's telling especially the males in his audience, that divorce is wrong. And he's intentionally frightening them. I mean, elsewhere they will ask Jesus, well, man, if that's true, it's better to not marry at all. And Jesus is getting at the covenant nature of marriage. Let's just understand what he is saying. First of all, in no area of life is grace more needed than in marriage. I think we can all agree with that. Being married is hard. I genuinely think Tanya is probably the easiest woman in the world to live with. and it's still the hardest thing I do. I can't, frankly, I can't imagine even doing it with anybody else because it's hard enough with her. I guarantee you it's hard for her to live with me. But we need God's grace. Marriage involves two fallen people with sinful, selfish desires in a world of temptation and difficulty, and they're striving to keep a covenant of selflessness and exclusivity and purity. Now how do two fallen people surrounded by all this temptation, by the struggle and battle of just living together, your body changing, everything changing as you go through life together, and then you say, okay, now you guys be faithful to each other. You only have sexual thoughts about each other. Well, man, how do you do that? And in our day, much like in Jesus' day, there are people who just say, it's too hard. It's too hard. I hear people all the time say, I don't have feelings anymore, and then they convince themselves that they never even really did. And they, again, justify, our own self-righteousness justifies this departure from our covenant. Now, divorce is sometimes allowed. The Bible gives us at least two exception clauses: adultery and abandonment. So divorce is sometimes allowed. It's, I tell you what, under the best of circumstances, in the clearest, most obvious circumstances where there is grounds for a biblical divorce, divorce is still terribly grievous and painful. It's always a breach of a covenant. It always is a failure of some kind. So divorce always represents a departure from God's will, because even if a person is justified in getting that divorce, they can't both be justified. Sometimes both are at fault, but it's never true that both are justified. There's no such scenario in the scripture of that. God is a covenant-keeping God. And because we are at enmity with God, the only way we can relate to him is through a covenant. And he establishes and keeps the covenant for us. That's what the gospel is about. So covenant breaking is not in the character of God. So Jesus comes along. Jesus, of course, is the one who ratifies the covenant. It's through his death that the covenant is carried out. And here Jesus stands before us, and his words shock us with their starkness. They really strike us as severe. Let's just be honest. We read these words of Jesus, and, well, now, just a minute. Where do our minds go? They immediately go to what we think are the exceptions. Yeah, but what about this? Well, we want to argue with Jesus. We want to push back because what he says is so shocking and so striking, and his words send us searching for forgiveness if we failed, for strength if we struggle. His words make us search to keep the covenant. All right, Lord, this is hard. We're like those Pharisees and scribes who later say to Jesus, okay, if that's true, maybe it's better to not marry at all. Because we always want the out. And Jesus just throws us out there. He doesn't mitigate it. He doesn't make it easier. He doesn't say, yeah, but. He doesn't say, okay, now here are the exceptions. Or anything. He just, boom, there it is. This is what he's doing in the Sermon on the Mount. Ultimately, what Jesus is telling us is we need a covenant that's greater than marriage. I need a covenant that's stronger than the one I have with my wife. I need a covenant with the Lord. I need a covenant that cannot be broken. I need a covenant of faith. And this is what Jesus is driving us to, that we are not by nature covenant keepers. It is in our nature to break the covenant. It's in our nature to find the way out. to come up with all the exceptions of why we shouldn't be bound by not just a covenant of marriage, any covenant we make, any agreement. Yeah, but you don't know what he did to me. You don't know what they did. And this is the way our minds work. And Jesus is saying, you need a covenant that cannot be broken. The only way we can be covenant keepers as human beings is to have the righteousness of Christ. The only way that I even have hope to be married well is to have a covenant with God through Jesus Christ. So the greatest need in marriage is not to try harder or to come up with some strategy for how we can be better. The greatest need in marriage is life in Jesus. And this is what he's driving us to. Every time he throws out one of these things, all right, he's talked to us about anger and lust, now marriage, and in every one of those, Jesus is saying, it's about who you are. It's not about what you do. So even if you've been married to the same person your whole adult life and you've never been divorced, don't pat yourself on the back like you're righteous. This is what he's getting at. Because have you not lusted? Have you not lusted after at least aloneness sometimes? Haven't you lusted after getting your way? And you've lusted after changing your spouse and all these things. We are not by nature covenant keepers. But Jesus is the one who meets the need and shapes us. So our hope for dealing with anger, lust, divorce, it's in Jesus. And now in verse 33, he says, again, you've heard it that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you've sworn. But I say to you, don't take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. Now, they had in their day a complex way of saying, well, I swear by this. And if you swore by this thing, well, that was considered, you could take it to the bank. If you swore by this, maybe it'll happen. I mean, it was sort of, can I really trust this person? And your oath was what let somebody know the degree of your trustworthiness. Jesus says, frankly, that his followers have to be committed to truth. Jesus is protecting speech here just like he does sex in verses 27 through 32. He says it's not only about what you do, it's about your heart. How is my heart disposed? Deception is a part of human nature. And the knowledge of deception, because we know people are deceitful, it causes cynicism. We're cynical. Well, how can I trust that guy? He might be lying to me. And Jesus is telling us that our speech discloses that about us. The fact that we have to take an oath shows that we are not by nature truthful. We don't speak truth by default. We don't speak truth or by degrees, because truth is either true or it's not. And we live in a day where now people say things like, well, this is my truth. You ever hear some of that? This is my truth. Speak your truth. Okay. How is that working? It just doesn't work. Everybody's got their own truth, and truth is no longer objective. It just shows the deceitfulness of the human heart. But what does God demand? God demands total truth. God demands total truth all the time, especially about ourselves and ultimately about Jesus. Now, when we speak truth about self, that's called confession. And grace, God's grace, changes our truth. Because it was true that I was on my way to hell, but by the grace of God, it's now true I'm on my way to heaven. It was true that I was outside of the covenant, but by God's grace now it's true that I am in the covenant. We no longer have a past, we have a future. We no longer have our sin. We have his righteousness. So Jesus is saying, there's just yes or no. This is not only true about what you say about your life and your actions, it's ultimately true about what you say about him. So he offers you the gospel. You know, Paul said that what God says is always yes in Christ Jesus. All his promises are yes and amen in Christ Jesus. Jesus here says you've got to say yes or no to the truth. So our commitment has to be, I'm going to speak the truth about myself, about Christ, about now. And it's a hard thing to come to grips with the truth about ourselves, but Jesus has been relentless in making us come face to face with it. It's not only about what I do, it's who I am. My anger, my lust, my covenant in marriage, the truth that I speak. What's Jesus pointing out to us? You aren't righteous. You don't have righteousness. Don't pat yourself on the back. You need to understand that you need the righteousness of Christ. And we'll pick up there next week. We talk about, he's got one more thing to say about retaliation and then loving our enemies. And we will go from there.